The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant call of an owl. Chris lay curled up on the old, worn-out rug in Bill's cabin, his golden fur catching the faint glow of the fireplace. Bill sat in his creaky wooden chair, staring at the envelope in his hands. The words scrawled across it, "Everything you know is a lie," seemed to burn into his mind. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the envelope over, looking for any clue as to who might have left it. But there was nothing. No name, no address, no sign of the sender. Chris lifted his head, sensing Bill's unease. The dog's brown eyes, warm and trusting, met Bill's, and for a moment, the man felt a pang of guilt. He had named this dog after his son, a boy he had lost too soon. It had been years since his son's passing, but the wound still felt fresh, especially now, with this mysterious message stirring up memories he had tried to bury. Who would do this, Chris? Bill muttered, more to himself than to the dog. Who even knows we're out here? The cabin was isolated, hidden deep within the woods, far from the nearest town. Bill had chosen this place deliberately, a sanctuary from the world that had taken so much from him. But now, it seemed, the world had found him again. Chris whined softly, his tail thumping against the floor. Bill reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, the gesture calming them both. "It's all right, boy," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "We'll figure this out." The next morning, Bill woke early, the envelope still weighing heavily on his mind. He decided to take Chris for a walk, hoping the crisp morning air would clear his thoughts. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. Chris bounded ahead, his nose to the ground, sniffing out every new scent. Bill followed at a slower pace, his eyes scanning the trees, half expecting to see someone watching them. As they walked, Bill's mind wandered back to the day he had found Chris. The dog had been alone, scared, and abandoned, much like Bill himself. Taking him, and it felt like fate, a second chance to care for someone or something when he had failed to save his own son. But now, with this envelope, it felt as though the past was reaching out to haunt him. When they returned to the cabin, Bill noticed something strange. The door, which he was certain he had closed tightly, was slightly ajar. His heart raced as he pushed it open, Chris growling softly beside him. Inside, nothing seemed out of place. The furniture was as he had left it, the fire long since burned out. But on the table, where the envelope had been, there was now a single photograph. Bill picked it up, his breath catching in his throat. It was a picture of his son, Chris, taken just weeks before his death. The boy was smiling, his eyes bright with life. On the back of the photo, written in the same handwriting as the envelope, were the words, "He wasn't the only one." That night, Bill couldn't sleep. The photograph and the message gnawed at him, pulling him deeper into a maze of questions and fears. Who had left these things? What did they mean? And why now, after all these years? Chris lay at the foot of the bed, his presence a small comfort. But even the dog seemed restless, his ears twitching at every sound. At some point, Bill must have dozed off, because he woke suddenly to the sound of scratching at the door. Chris was already on his feet, his hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Bill grabbed the flashlight from his nightstand and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady despite the fear tightening his chest. There was no answer, only the sound of footsteps retreating into the darkness. Bill opened the door, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the night. There, on the doorstep, was another envelope. This one was smaller, sealed with a red wax stamp. Bill hesitated before picking it up, his hands trembling once more. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the message brief but chilling. "The truth will find you, whether you're ready or not." As the days passed, the mystery deepened. More envelopes appeared, each one containing cryptic messages or fragments of the past Bill had tried to forget. Chris stayed by his side, a loyal companion through the growing storm of uncertainty. But with each new revelation, Bill felt the walls of his isolated world closing in. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Bill sat on the porch with Chris at his feet. He stared out at the forest, the shadows lengthening with the fading light. "What are they trying to tell me, Chris?" he murmured. "What do they want from us?" The dog looked up at him, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. For the first time in years, Bill felt a flicker of hope. Whatever was coming, whatever secrets were being unearthed, he wouldn't face them alone. Chris was with him, and together, they would find the truth. But as the night settled in, a figure watched from the edge of the trees, hidden in the darkness. The game was far from over, and the next move would change everything. The days turned into weeks, and the envelopes kept coming. Each one was more unsettling than the last, pulling Bill further into a web of confusion and dread. The messages were cryptic, hinting at secrets buried long ago, secrets Bill had never wanted to confront. But now, they were impossible to ignore. One envelope contained a faded newspaper clipping. It was an article about a car accident from over a decade ago, the accident that had taken his son's life. Bill's hand shook as he read the headline. "Tragic crash claims young life." The article was brief, but someone had circled a single sentence in red ink. "The cause of the accident remains under investigation." Beneath it, scrawled in the same handwriting, were the words, "It wasn't an accident." Bill felt the ground shift beneath him. He had always believed it was a tragic twist of fate, a moment of bad luck that had stolen his son from him. But now, doubt crept in, gnawing at the edges of his mind. What if there was more to it? What if someone had been responsible? Chris nuzzled against Bill's leg, sensing his distress. The dog's warm presence was a small comfort, but it wasn't enough to quiet the storm raging inside Bill. He knelt down and wrapped his arms around Chris, burying his face in the dog's soft fur. "What do they want from me, boy?" he whispered. "Why are they doing this?" The next envelope arrived on a stormy night. The wind howled through the trees, and rain lashed against the windows of the cabin. Bill had been sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, when he heard the familiar sound of something being slipped under the door. Chris was on his feet in an instant, growling softly as he approached the door. Bill opened it cautiously, the cold wind biting at his face. There was no one there, just the darkness and the rain. He picked up the envelope, his heart pounding as he tore it open. Inside was a single key and a note. "The answers are waiting. Follow the trail." The key was old and tarnished, with a small tag attached to it. On the tag was an address, a location in the nearby town that Bill hadn't visited in years. He turned the key over in his hands, his mind racing. What could it unlock? And who had left it for him? Chris whined, his ears flattening against his head. Bill looked down at the dog, his loyal companion, and made a decision. "We'll go tomorrow," he said firmly. "We'll find out what this is all about." The next morning, Bill and Chris set out for the town. The forest was eerily quiet, the storm having passed and left behind a heavy mist that clung to the trees. Bill kept the key in his pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the mystery he was about to unravel. When they reached the address, Bill's heart sank. It was an old storage facility, its gates rusted and its walls covered in ivy. The place looked abandoned, but the key fit perfectly into the lock on the main gate. With a deep breath, Bill pushed the gate open and stepped inside. The facility was a maze of crumbling buildings and overgrown paths. Chris stayed close to Bill, his ears perked and his eyes scanning the shadows. They followed the numbers on the buildings until they found the one that matched the address on the key's tag. The door to the unit was heavy and creaked loudly as Bill pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the dim light revealed stacks of boxes and old furniture. But in the center of the room was a single, small chest. It was locked, but the key Bill had been given fit perfectly. Inside the chest was a collection of items that made Bill's blood run cold. There were photographs of his son, Chris, from before the accident. There were letters, some addressed to Bill, others to people he didn't recognize. And at the bottom of the chest was a journal, Its pages filled with handwriting he knew all too well, his own. Bill's hands trembled as he opened the journal. The entries were from the months leading up to his son's death, but they were filled with details he didn't remember writing. There were mentions of arguments, of threats, of a secret he had sworn to keep. And on the last page, a single sentence stood out. "If anything happens to me, it's because of him." Bill stumbled back, the journal falling from his hands. Chris whined, pressing against his leg, but Bill barely noticed. His mind was reeling, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together in a way he didn't want to accept. Had someone been threatening his son? Had he known about it and done nothing? Or worse, had he been involved? The sound of footsteps outside the unit snapped Bill out of his thoughts. He turned, his heart racing, just as a figure appeared in the doorway. It was a man, his face shadowed by the hood of his coat. Bill couldn't make out his features, but the man's voice was cold and steady. "You shouldn't have come here, Bill," the man said. "Some secrets are better left buried." Before Bill could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the mist. Chris barked, straining against his leash, but Bill held him back. His mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, but one thing was clear: this was far from over. As Bill and Chris left the storage facility, the weight of the truth, or what little he had uncovered, pressed down on him. The key, the journal, the man in the shadows. It was all connected, and Bill knew he couldn't stop now. He had to keep digging, no matter how painful the answers might be. But as they walked back through the forest, the mist closing in around them, Bill couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Someone was out there, someone who knew more than they were letting on. And they weren't done with him yet. To be continued.